June 22nd, 2026. Welcome to the video, everyone. Let me ask you something before we even get started. What does it look like when a military machine that seemed unstoppable for a year and a half quietly begins to eat itself from the inside? Not dramatically, not with a single turning point you can point to on a map, but slowly, system by system, layer by layer, until one morning a refinery 9 miles from the most guarded building in Russia is throwing fireballs into the Moscow skyline, and ordinary residents are filming it from their balconies in disbelief. That is the image we need to hold in our heads today, because that image is not the story. That image is the receipt for everything that went wrong before it. For 18 months, the trajectory of this war felt almost mathematically predictable. Russian forces advancing across eastern Ukraine, one tree line at a time, one flattened settlement after another, grinding forward through sheer weight of numbers and an apparent willingness to pay whatever human cost the map required. Western analysts were calling it a slow-motion compression. Ukrainian commanders were fighting with everything available just to slow the pace of loss. And then, over a period of weeks, something shifted so fundamentally that the numbers attached to it are still difficult to fully absorb. Ukrainian forces reportedly recaptured more than 600 square kilometers of ground. Not held, recaptured. Ground that Russian forces had bled enormously to take. And 3 nights before we're having this conversation, a coordinated drone strike hit multiple Russian regions simultaneously, including the capital itself, setting fire to a fuel facility that reportedly supplies a significant portion of Moscow's regional energy needs. Now here's where most of the coverage goes wrong. People look at that refinery burning and they think the story is the audacity of the strike, the symbolism. Ukraine hitting Moscow. And yes, that matters politically and psychologically. But that framing actually undersells what's really happening, because if you understand what had to go wrong inside the Russian military system for that drone to reach its target in the first place, the refinery fire stops being a dramatic headline and starts being a diagnostic result. It tells you about the condition of the patient, and the patient is not well. Let's go back to how Russia's offensive actually operated for most of 2024 and into 2025, because the method matters enormously for understanding why it eventually stalled. Russian forces were not winning traditional military engagements in the classical sense. They were accumulating positions. Small groups of soldiers, sometimes just a handful of men, would slip through gaps in Ukrainian lines, establish a presence on a piece of ground, and that position would then be added to maps as Russian-controlled territory, kilometer by kilometer, village by village. The cost in human lives by most serious Western assessments was staggering, approaching figures that would have been considered politically unsurvivable for almost any other government on Earth. But the map kept moving, and a moving map is its own form of domestic propaganda. So the losses were paid, and the advance continued. Now think about this. What makes that method work? It relies on a few things simultaneously. It relies on small units being able to communicate with each other and with command structures behind them. It relies on those positions being consolidated into something defensible once they're taken. And it relies on the command having an accurate picture of where its forces actually are at any given moment. Pull any one of those threads, and the whole approach begins to unravel. What happened in late January and early February of this year is that multiple threads got pulled at almost exactly the same time. Here's where it gets genuinely interesting, and I want you to follow this carefully because it sounds almost too precise to be real, but the strategic implications are enormous. Russian drone operators had been navigating their aircraft over significant distances under live human control by using commercial satellite internet access. The same network, incidentally, that Ukraine had relied on desperately in the earliest days of the full-scale invasion. When Ukrainian officials examined the wreckage of a drone that had slipped through air defenses and entered the government district in Kiev, flying low enough that people in upper-floor offices reportedly watched it pass their windows, they found that commercial satellite terminal embedded in its construction. That discovery went directly to the company behind the network. The engineering response by most accounts took roughly a day. A system was implemented that restricted active terminals to registered Ukrainian users and introduced automatic shutoffs for any terminal moving above a certain speed, effectively any terminal attached to a moving aircraft. When that switch flipped in early February, thousands of Russian terminals went offline simultaneously. Now understand what that means operationally. Russia's forward units in contested areas had quietly built their real-time communications on borrowed civilian infrastructure, not as a temporary workaround, as an actual dependency. When those terminals went dark, soldiers in the field lost contact with their own rear. Commanders lost visibility on unit positions. The nervous system of the advance went quiet in multiple sectors at the same moment. Ukrainian drone operators later described the disorientation among opposing forces in terms that are almost uncomfortable to repeat. The Russian military bloggers, the embedded correspondents who document this war from the Russian side and who are generally not known for softening difficult truths, posted that there was no adequate alternative available. Not immediately, not even close. The estimated territorial recovery in the weeks following that communications collapse reportedly reached into the hundreds of square kilometers, and there is a detail in the aftermath worth sitting with. Ukrainian intelligence assets apparently geolocated somewhere in the range of 2,000 or more Russian terminals in a single week. Not because Russian operators made themselves visible deliberately, but because the moment connectivity dropped, desperate attempts to reconnect produced signals that functioned essentially as location beacons. Every attempt to get back online was an announcement. Here I am. Try to picture the scale of that intelligence harvest. But here's what makes this even more significant. The Kremlin's own decisions in the days immediately following the communications collapse appear, in retrospect, to have made things considerably worse. Russia's domestic internet regulator moved to restrict access to a widely used messaging application that had become, in practice, a critical informal communications layer for military units in the field. Soldiers were using it to share targeting coordinates, relay drone footage, coordinate between positions that lacked formal communication links. The restriction was apparently justified through domestic data compliance rationale. The practical effect was that the secondary communication system, the improvised backup that units had been leaning on after the first system failed, was throttled away within weeks of the primary one going dark. Two civilian communication workarounds, both gone within a fortnight of each other, both apparently without the Russian military having an adequate substitute ready to deploy. What this produced at the unit level is the part that should genuinely unsettle anyone thinking seriously about Russian military planning. There are accounts suggesting that when command inspectors arrived at brigade positions to review operational maps, drone reconnaissance of the same ground revealed the maps were fundamentally inaccurate. Units believed they controlled ground they did not actually control, because the small infiltration groups that had pushed forward through the autumn had no reliable communication tying them into a unified command picture. They drew their positions based on where they were standing, and nobody above them had the connectivity to reconcile that picture against reality. In some sectors, it appears Russian command did not have an accurate picture of where its own front line actually was. Sit with that for a moment. You cannot defend ground you cannot locate. You cannot respond to a counterattack you did not know was coming because the people who would have warned you were offline. Russia is attempting to build a solution, a domestically controlled low-orbit satellite constellation with the stated ambition of providing continuous coverage and high-speed connectivity. On paper, it is exactly the right response to the dependency that got exposed. The arithmetic, however, is the problem. The number of satellites currently operational reportedly sits in the dozens. Continuous stable coverage of the kind required for military operations at scale requires hundreds of satellites, with the full operational plan reportedly extending toward a much larger constellation by the end of the decade. The gap between what exists now and what is needed is not a gap that can be closed this year or next year. And that gap, that window of time during which the offensive requires communications it does not reliably have, while the replacement system is still being assembled in orbit, is precisely the operational window that Ukraine appears to be exploiting with increasing sophistication. Now let's talk about the drone campaign against Russian energy infrastructure, because this is the second major pressure vector, and it connects directly to something that affects global markets in ways that are not immediately obvious. Ukraine has spent recent months systematically targeting fuel refineries, storage facilities, pumping infrastructure, and supply chain nodes deep inside Russian territory. Places that until relatively recently felt functionally safe from the reach of Ukrainian strikes. The attack that lit up Moscow's skyline was not an isolated event. It was the loudest iteration of an ongoing campaign that has been quietly degrading Russia's domestic fuel supply and the export revenue that funds the war simultaneously. One strike, two strategic outcomes. Here's why that matters beyond the headlines. Russia's government budget is structurally dependent on energy export revenue. Before the full-scale invasion, hydrocarbons accounted for a very substantial share of federal revenue, and while that share has shifted somewhat under sanctions pressure, the fundamental dependency has not disappeared. Every refinery that goes offline does two things at once. It reduces the fuel available to keep military logistics moving toward the front, and it reduces the processed output available for export, which reduces the hard currency flowing into the budget that pays for everything else. Ukraine figured out, and it appears correctly, that you do not necessarily need to defeat an army on the field if you can systematically degrade the economic infrastructure that sustains it. The domestic indicators inside Russia are beginning to reflect this pressure in ways that are increasingly difficult to conceal. Independent reporting suggests that fuel availability at the retail level has been showing strain, with restrictions appearing at filling stations in various regions. Prices at the pump have reportedly risen meaningfully. The impact appears particularly pronounced in certain regions, including areas tied to the occupied South. When a country that defines itself in significant part through its energy wealth starts rationing gasoline domestically, Something structural has come loose in the system. Now here's the twist that looks like good news for Moscow, but actually isn't. Oil prices have remained elevated through this period, partly driven by the situation in the Persian Gulf and concerns about global supply disruption. Higher crude prices theoretically mean more revenue flowing to the Kremlin, and on the surface, some economic forecasters have indeed adjusted Russian growth projections upward slightly on the back of the price environment. So Putin gets a financial windfall precisely when the front line is under the most pressure. Doesn't that fix the problem? Here's why it doesn't. Money is no longer the binding constraint on Russian military performance. The binding constraints are men, equipment, and logistics coherence. You can have a treasury that looks healthy on paper and still be losing ground because your soldiers cannot communicate, your recruits are not arriving in sufficient numbers, and your replacement satellite constellation is years from operational. The oil revenue is real. Its ability to solve the specific problems Russia is facing right now is limited. And the underlying economic picture, strip away the oil price premium, is genuinely concerning for Moscow's medium-term position. The sovereign wealth reserves that were supposed to absorb exactly this kind of sustained pressure have been drawn down substantially over the past 4 years. Interest rates have been held at elevated levels to combat inflation, which has shown up most painfully in food prices. Key trading partners that had been absorbing Russian crude at discounted prices appear to have been reducing their exposure. And in what may be the most revealing single data point of all, Russia's own official budget planning reportedly penciled in a reduction in defense spending for the coming year, not because the government wants to fight less, because the arithmetic of the budget finally forced the acknowledgement that spending cannot continue at the current trajectory indefinitely. Here's the irony that deserves to be named directly. The company whose technology both enabled Russian drone operations for a period and then, through its own corrective action, effectively dismantled that capability, completed a public market listing this year at a valuation that represents one of the largest in market history. The asymmetry is not merely military, it is industrial, economic, and technological. And it ran through a stock exchange while Russia's replacement satellite constellation counts its operational units in the dozens. Which brings us to the dimension that cannot be papered over by any favorable oil price movement, and which the official Russian government line works hardest to obscure: the recruitment picture. Independent analysts tracking regional budget allocations, following the actual money committed to recruit signing bonuses, which is harder to fabricate than official announcements, identified what appears to be a meaningful decline in new recruitment in the early part of this year compared with the preceding period. The daily intake of new soldiers appears to have dropped from previous rates. At the same time, the financial incentive required to attract each new recruit has reached record levels, with signing bonuses climbing to their highest point in the conflict. Think about what that combination tells you. If you are paying more than ever and receiving fewer volunteers than before, the constraint is not financial. The constraint is that fewer people are willing to accept the offer at any price. You do not double the incentive for something that is selling easily. And against that backdrop of declining recruitment, the loss rate on the other side of the equation has not declined. Ukrainian official statements have described a period during which Russian battlefield losses, from all causes, including combat casualties, incapacitation, and desertion, appeared to be running ahead of the new recruits arriving to replace them. If that assessment is even partially accurate, the direction of that arithmetic is not sustainable. And it is not exclusively a military problem. Every man absorbed into the military force structure is a man removed from a civilian economy already experiencing significant labor shortages, in a country whose demographic trajectory before the invasion had already been unfavorable. The Army and the Treasury are competing for the same shrinking pool of working-age men, and the Army is currently winning that competition in ways that may cost the economy significantly over time. Now, I want to be precise here because honest analysis requires holding complexity rather than collapsing it into a simple narrative. Russia has not collapsed. Russian forces are still advancing in some sectors. They are still launching large-scale strikes against Ukrainian population centers. They still maintain numerical advantages in certain categories of military capacity. The frontline picture described by serious Western military analysts is not a rout. It is something more like a strategic equilibrium that has become tactically unstable, frozen at the broad level while volatile and lethal at the local level. 600 square kilometers of recovered ground is meaningful and significant, but it is not the decisive collapse of Russian military capacity. The war continues. The dying continues. What has changed is momentum. And in extended military conflicts, momentum is not simply a psychological variable. It determines who is making choices and who is reacting to them. For much of the past 18 months, Russia was making the choices, setting the pace and the place of engagement. The accumulated pressures described here, the communications collapse, the energy infrastructure campaign, the recruitment decline, the reserve drawdown, appear to have shifted that dynamic meaningfully, even if not permanently. The Russian military blogging community, which tends to be more candid than official channels about operational realities, appears to reflect this shift in its tone. The questions being asked publicly in those spaces about why sufficient resources are not being committed, about what has to happen before the war is prosecuted more seriously, are not the questions of a community that believes it is prevailing. And the political dimension is catching up to the battlefield picture. Renewed American engagement with the Ukrainian situation following a period of reduced involvement appears to be at least partly informed by an assessment that the current moment represents a genuine shift in leverage. The Kremlin's reaction to that re-engagement, public grumbling about external influences on American decision-making, combined with expressions of continued interest in diplomatic channels, reads less like the posture of a confident military power, and more like the posture of an actor trying to manage a situation that has moved beyond its preferred parameters. So when you see that Moscow refinery burning and you hear people filming it in astonishment from their apartment balconies, understand what you are actually looking at. You are looking at the visible edge of a system that has been accumulating invisible failures for months. The drone that reached that target did so because the communications architecture that should have detected and reported it was degraded. The refinery it hit had already been struck before because the deep strike campaign had found its rhythm. The air defense that failed to intercept it completely was operating in an environment shaped by months of systematic pressure. None of those conditions appeared overnight. All of them built gradually, quietly, and then arrived in the same season. That is how military momentum actually shifts, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the convergence of pressures that were each individually survivable, becoming simultaneously unsustainable. And the question that follows is the one that cannot be answered with confidence yet, whether what we are watching is a temporary inflection point that the weight of Russian resources eventually reverses, or something more structural. The honest answer is that serious analysts are genuinely uncertain. Momentum in this conflict has shifted before. It may shift again. But the mechanisms that produced the current shift, the communications vulnerability, the energy targeting logic, the demographic arithmetic, are not going to simply disappear. They are structural features of the situation, and structural features tend to compound rather than resolve on their own. The smoke over Moscow cleared days ago. The questions it raised are still in the air, and they deserve more than a headline's worth of attention.